In Tallahassee, Judges Nikki Clark and Terry Lewis threw out the challenge to absentee ballots by Democratic voters, and that left the Gore team with only one card to play: an appeal to the Supreme Court of Florida to reverse Judge Sanders Sauls and order an immediate manual recount of thousands of disputed ballots. The U.S. Supreme Court had already struck down the Florida court's first effort in the election dispute, and the pundit said Gore's second attempt was at best a long shot, and time was running out.
That Friday morning, when official Washington had pretty much written off Al Gore for dead, I spoke with someone on the Baker team who said, this isn't over.
The talk around town was, when will Gore concede? Will he concede Saturday in prime time or Sunday in prime time? Because after the Florida Supreme Court had been scolded by the U.S. Supreme Court, the conventional wisdom was they would be chastened and they would step back and they would not try to overturn a trial court ruling that had gone so against Gore in Judge Saul's courtroom.
This really was a situation where he was only a few hours away from again conceding the presidency. And then suddenly the life just gets lifted back into his campaign.
The Circuit Court of the Second Judicial Circuit here in Tallahassee shall immediately begin a manual recount of the approximately 9,000 Miami-Dade ballots that registered under votes.
I don't think anyone anticipated this kind of decision by the state Supreme Court, other than perhaps Al Gore.
Because time is of the essence, the recount shall commence immediately.
They're all appointed by Democratic governors, except for one who was appointed, I guess, jointly by Governor Bush and Governor Childs. Are they bad people? Probably not. Do they have a little bias? Probably so.
They literally had the champagne in the Bush lawyers' offices here in Tallahassee, chilling, ready to pop the corks, ready to celebrate their victory in the Florida Supreme Court, ready for Governor Bush to be President-elect Bush.
We have no alternative other than to appeal once again to the Supreme Court of the United States for relief.
And he goes off to the ranch to kind of lick his wounds. And Al Gore's beginning to plan his administration.
I wanted to throw my arm around him and give him a hug. It was a great day, really, for democracy in this country and for the voters of Florida.
I never felt, and do not feel now, despite what some persons have said, that the Florida Supreme Court was political in the sense that it had a design to elect either candidate as president. I have never believed that. I don't believe it.
Welcome to the Florida Supreme Court.
I think that these justices, as is the case with any judge and probably any human being, have ideological postures that will affect, to the extent that they believe the law allows it to, will affect their ultimate decisions.
Meanwhile, all of the top staffers, they head down to a popular Washington restaurant, the Palm, the most political restaurant in town. They're greeted with a standing ovation when they come in. Tom Nides, one of the top aides to Al Gore, says, announces to the crowd, "We live for another day."
That's why today was a great day. It's because we're going to finally get those votes counted.
That night, we literally saw plane after plane after plane arriving at the Tallahassee airport. Democrats flying into town, Republicans flying into town, both sides fanning out across the state with their lawyers, their observer teams, trying to make sure that this recount, in as much as they could control it, went their way.
What I'd like is your suggestions on how to best comply with the Supreme Court's directive.
There were between 14 and 17 different plane loads of people that were marshaled together and flown to Tallahassee so that they could be ready to participate in this process of recounting.
In Leon County, at the public library, 4 teams of 2 judges, plus onlookers and legal representatives from the Bush and Gore teams, are counting those undervotes from Miami-Dade County.
There was no acrimony, there was no complaint. It was just a recognition that this was one more challenge that we had to confront and we needed to get on with it.
Word came from the judge who had just heard it,
on the board, the election board, that the Supreme Court had ordered a stay.
Your Honor, if I may, I'm advised that the U.S. Supreme Court has just halted the recount.
All right.
About a 60 confirm.
Confirm that. Well, does that TV work at all?
Everyone just was stunned. The judges were wandering around. One judge did not want to stop. She said, until we get a written order, I think we should continue.
The Republicans in the room outside in the viewing area had heard about it as well, and it was a huge cheer.
I am sure that the Vice President of the United States is disappointed.
This was just an unbelievable roller coaster, and I've never liked roller coasters. I mean, they really make me dizzy.
The Supreme Court decision comes, and everything is utterly reversed. You know, suddenly it's party time in Crawford, Texas.
Well, that was horrible. I mean, that was the lowest point of all this, lower even than the final result, which was by then almost predictable, was their decision to stay the recount. I mean, one saw democracy at work. You saw earnest people around the state, judges and lay people, carefully counting ballots, and it really looked like they would meet the deadline that had been set of 2 p.m. on Sunday.
There was no overwhelming celebration, no relaxation. People were still girded for what it was that they knew was ahead of them in terms of presenting the arguments to the Supreme Court.
When the stay was issued, there was a great deal of jubilation. But they have been through this so many times before that I think everyone is afraid to celebrate. Because every time they think something is won, it is, you know, victory is snatched from before them. After
the Florida Supreme Court decision, followed within 24 hours by the U.S. Supreme Court decision, one of my colleagues at Newsweek asked Karen Hughes of the Bush campaign for her reaction, and she said, I am just out of reactions. I don't have any reaction because I can't have any more.
Who knew that if you press the accelerator down on the U.S. Supreme Court, it could actually go to 90 miles an hour in 3 seconds? This was the Supreme Court at supersonic speed.
Coming up, the lawyers head back to Washington for what everyone agrees will be the decisive battle.
The Bush team had made basically 3 arguments. If they won any of them, they win the case.
For the second time, the Bush and Gore legal teams find themselves standing before the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. By now, the deadline for naming electors to the Electoral College is only days away, and the Florida legislature is poised to take things into its own hands. Time is not on Al Gore's side, and it appears neither is the Supreme Court.
For the Gore team, all they wanted was another day or 2 of life. Please send this back to Florida. We don't care what the standard is. Make it the highest standard possible, the toughest standard. But allow some recounts to continue. The Bush team had made basically 3 arguments. If they won any of them, they win the case. They're saying there's a federal constitutional problem, there is a statutory problem, there's an equal protection problem.
Any minute now, the arguments will begin before the U.S. Supreme Court. 3 attorneys, 90 minutes, and the fate of the presidency hanging in the balance. It is the second shot for Al Gore and George W. Bush before the nation's highest court, and with time running short, this could be the final fight in the battle for the White House.
You had Justices Scalia and Rehnquist asking very tough questions of David Boies on the sort of broadest federal issues.
No, it's only based on
which he then accepts.
No, it's only based on the certifications that are contested. In other words, if you're going to order the manual review of the ballots, the issue is what ballots are contested, and second, is there judicial review of those ballots?
You have to know how close the state election was, don't you?
You had Justices Souter and Breyer asking a lot of questions about the standard, Breyer in particular.
But in your opinion, if you were looking for a basically fair standard to take one out of a hat, Indiana
or Palm Beach 1990, in your opinion, would be a basically fair one?
If I were to take one out of a hat, Your Honor, if I was a legislature, what I would do is I would hold that you have to punch the Chad through on a ballot.
And in the end, that's what he wanted. He wanted to send it back with a new standard.
Justice Brennan, the difficulty is that under, I'm sorry.
When Joe Clark called Justice Stevens, Justice Brennan, there was sort of this gasp in the nation's highest court. Justice Brennan, who was so beloved and revered, has been dead for 5 years. And then he compounds it by calling another justice the wrong name.
Justice Breyer, what I'm saying is that...
I'm Justice Souter. You better cut that out.
And that just made it worse. And then Scalia with his, great sort of court jester comic timing.
That's correct.
Mr. Clark, I'm Scalia.
Yes, sir. I remember that.
Probably felt under siege and he wanted to just melt through a crack in the floor.
But in the context of selection of presidential electors, isn't there a big red flag up there? Watch out.
I think there is, in a sense, Your Honor, and I think the Florida Supreme Court was grappling with that.
And you think it did it properly?
I think it did do it properly.
That's, I think, a concern that we have.
It seemed to become clear as the 90 minutes wore on that it was going to be very, very hard for David Boies to do what he knew he had to do, which was to get one of those swing votes, one of those moderates.
Many people thought that we would have a decision that same day. Around 7 p.m., the word came out, no decision tonight.
Next day comes, we're thinking it's going to happen in the morning.
10 o'clock came, no decision. 11, 12, noon, 1. And now the speculation began.
People start thinking, well, what's taking them so long?
Are they concocting a grand scheme to have a new recount with new standards?
So everybody back at campaign headquarters is hunkered down in their offices watching news coverage. Bush is doing the same thing, but in the governor's mansion. And when word of the ruling actually comes down, we know that Al Gore is at home with family. Bush is in the same position. And as it comes down, James Baker, his point man down in Florida, he's actually asleep at the time that he hears that the ruling is imminent. He quickly gets the legal team together.
All right, here we go. Where to go. Bob Reed.
We have a decision. We don't know what it is, but the Supreme Court has reached a decision. And I looked at my watch and it was 9:52 p.m.
Your wireless is kind of hanging there.
Thanks.
And rush up to our camera.
As I look through here, to be a 5-4 opinion.
So now here we are, both rushing through this. It's sort of like two tourists in Turkey trying to figure out the phrase book for where's the ambulance.
What are they asking the Supreme Court to do? And we should know that in just a bit.
And I think you have to say that this is not the clearest opinion in the United States Supreme Court history. It reads like a committee effort, which it is.
It's not very straightforward.
And Bush's best friend and campaign chairman Don Evans is on the ground in Tallahassee on the phone with then Governor Bush as the ruling is coming in. At one point it's getting so complicated they don't know what the win language is. They don't know if there's any clear language saying that he's won, that Evans says to Bush, buddy, I got to call you back.
I wasn't going to say this is what it means until I knew for sure it's what it meant. And there was a point where I found a passage that made it clear to me that this case was over.
Action in violation of the Florida Election Code and hence could not be part of an appropriate order authorized by Florida Statute 102.16.
And after reading it, I said, Tom,
I think that means this is over.
The only holding of the court was that there was a violation of equal protection, meaning the fact that there was no uniform objective standard for judging those ballots made it such that it just wasn't fair.
And I remember looking up at the clock saying to myself, well, if Gore is going to turn this around, he has to get in before the Supreme Court, get a uniform standard to recount, and have the recount completed by midnight. That's the way I was reading it. and I knew that would be impossible.